Kata Transit Hub smelled like recycled air and old sorrow. Every displaced person who passed through its corridors left something of themselves behind, a grief, a fear, a habit of watching the door. After 3 years stationed there as a civil liaison officer, I had learned to read those deposits the way a geologist reads strata. I knew the particular stillness of someone who had never expected to leave home. I knew the careful way a dispossessed person held their one remaining bag. I knew the sound a family made when they were trying not to take up too much space. I had never seen anything quite like the Vorn. They arrived in the 5th month of the Kauda Accords. A delegation of 87 displaced Vorn nobility and their attendant staff routed through our station while the diplomatic machinery ground through its slow negotiations 3 systems away. The Vorn were tall, amber-skinned, precise in their movement, and organized with a rigidity that made our own military look casual. They filed through intake processing in strict hierarchical order. They ate in strict hierarchical order. They occupied the temporary quarters we assigned them in strict hierarchical order. Within 48 hours, they had imposed their entire social architecture on a section of the station that had been, the week before, converted freight bay full of fold-down cots and portable partitioning. My job was to make sure their basic needs were met. Paperwork was in order, and the friction between the Vorn delegation and the 3 other displaced populations currently sheltering at Kauda stayed below the threshold of incident. It was not glamorous work. It involved a great deal of walking long corridors, a great deal of signing forms that other people had written, and a great deal of quiet problem-solving in the pre-dawn hours, when the environmental systems cycled their filters and the whole station creaked like a settling house. I was good at the walking. I was good at the quiet. I noticed her on the 3rd evening. The Vorn quarters occupied decks 9 through 11, a long run of converted freight space that the station engineers had divided into private cells with modular partitioning. The cells were sparse but enclosed. More privacy than most displaced populations received, a concession the Vorn senior delegate had negotiated before they arrived. Consul Vrethus was a compact, iron-haired Vorn male of some age, the particular confidence of a man who had never in his life been asked to wait for anything. He ran his delegation like a garrison. He signed nothing he had not reviewed 3 times. He spoke to me with the measured politeness of someone managing a necessary inconvenience. I did not dislike Vrethus. I had worked with harder men than him. But I noticed early that his administration of the delegation had a very specific gap in it. Deck 9 had a maintenance corridor that ran the full length of the freight bay, a narrow service passage between the modular partitioning and the outer hull, wide enough for 2 people walking carefully. At the far end, where the corridor turned to meet the station's observation gallery, someone had neglected to seal a viewport damaged during the war transit. Transparency looked out over the station's underbelly, and beyond it, the scorched surface of the border world below. Brown and gray and scarred. A world that had been someone's home before the shelling. The viewport was not beautiful. Through it, you could see the stars beyond the damaged atmosphere. And there were a lot of them. She was sitting on the deck plating at the base of the viewport when I first saw her. She was young. I put her at somewhere between 20 and 25 standard years, though I had not yet learned enough about Vorn physiology to be certain. She wore the simple gray inner robe that seemed to be standard Vorn underdress, not the embroidered outer layers I saw on the other women of her apparent rank. Her hair was close-cropped, very dark, almost a blue-black indigo. Her knees were drawn up to her chest. She was looking out through the cracked viewport at the stars, and she was not moving, and she had a quality of stillness that I associated with people who had learned to be invisible. I almost walked past. I had a maintenance inspection to log, and a water recycler on deck 10 that had been flagging errors for 6 hours. Instead, I stopped. I stopped because I had been doing this work for 3 years, and in 3 years I had learned that when someone makes themselves that still, it is rarely peace, it is practice. It is a person who has spent a long time perfecting the art of taking up no space. I looked at her for a moment. She had not looked at me. She may not have heard me over the station's ambient hum. Then I went and logged my maintenance report and fixed the water recycler. But I came back the same way when I was done, 2 hours later, and she was still there. And this time I stopped for longer. She had a piece of what appeared to be compressed paper in her lap. The Vorn equivalent, I would later learn, of a sketch pad. And she was drawing with a thin stylus. I could not see what she was drawing from my angle. Her hand was moving with the focused, unself-conscious movement of someone who draws because they need to, not because they are performing it for anyone. I did not disturb her. I went back to my quarters. But I thought about her for a longer time than I should have, given that I had 312 other displaced persons on my case files and a water recycler that was going to flag again by morning. I came back with a ration tray the following evening. It was nothing special. The Cotta kitchen ran a rotating menu of 17 items, and I had picked the two that I personally found least objectionable: a dense grain teen block and a sealed cup of something warm that approximated a broth if you did not look at it too closely. I had also added a small portion of preserved fruit that the kitchen kept for the populations that needed higher sugar intake, because I had no idea what Vorn dietary requirements looked like, and it seemed better to offer more than less. She was in the same position, same viewport, same compressed paper pad. When I came around the bend in the maintenance corridor, she looked up, and I saw her face properly for the first time. Large dark irises, very dark, the pupil almost indistinguishable from the iris itself, ringed with a faint luminous line that caught the light of the corridor. High cheekbones. A mouth that was at that moment arranged in an expression of very careful neutrality. She looked at the tray, then at me, then at the tray again. I held it out. "I don't know what you've been eating," I said, "but I noticed you weren't in the delegation's meal rotation." She said nothing. The neutrality in her face did not change, but something behind the dark eyes shifted. A small recalibration, as though she had been expecting something other than what I had just said. I set the tray on the deck, plating beside her, because holding it out indefinitely seemed like pressure, and I did not want to apply pressure. Then I sat down on the deck about a meter away and leaned my back against the outer hull and looked out through the cracked viewport at the stars. We stayed like that for a while. I was not in a hurry. The water recycler was not going to flag until morning. After some time, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 15, I heard the soft sound of the tray being lifted. I did not look over. I kept looking at the stars. Eventually she said something. It was in Vorn, which at that point I understood approximately 12 words of, none of them relevant to the current situation. Voice was low and careful, in the manner of someone who has not used it much recently. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't have much Vorn. I have a translation chip, but it's field grade and it makes a noise." She looked at me. Then she said, "Accented but fully functional accord standard." I said, "You do not know who I am." "That's correct." I said, "I don't. The others know." She said, "They know, and they do not bring trays." I thought about that. "Then the others are wrong," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those dark, luminous ringed eyes. Then, she looked back out at the stars and said nothing further. She ate the grain block and drank the warm broth, and when I left, an hour later, the tray was empty. I came back the next evening. In the evening after that, her name was Thessaly Vorn. She told me on the 5th evening, without preamble. I arrived to find her already looking toward the bend in the corridor, as though she had been listening for footsteps. And before I had set the tray down, she said, "My name is Thessaly, second daughter of the Vorn succession." A pause. "In the old counting." "Xon," I said. "Civil liaison, 3rd grade, in the current counting." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape a smile starts from. "You are very low rank," she said. "I am," I agreed. "It suits me." She picked up the broth. "Vorn do not value low rank." "I know. How's that working out for everyone?" This time the corner of her mouth moved further. It became, briefly and unmistakably, a smile, small, contained, gone almost as quickly as it arrived, but it was there. I did not press it. I sat and looked at the stars, and we were quiet together. Over the following weeks I learned her story in the way you learn anything worth knowing, slowly in pieces with long silences between. She did not volunteer information easily. She gave it the way someone who has had things taken from them gives anything, carefully, watching to see what you do with each piece before offering the next. Thessaly had been born with a condition the Vorn called voided sight. Vision was fully functional by any medical standard. She could see with precision at distance in low light. What she could not see was color. World was a complete and detailed landscape of grayscale, every shape and texture rendered in perfect clarity, every shade of darkness and light distinguishable. But without the chromatic spectrum that Vorn culture had, over centuries, embedded deep into its theology. The Vorn experienced color the way some species experience sound, as language, as spiritual information, as the medium through which the sacred was communicated. Their ceremonial robes were specific colors for specific prayers. Their recognition rites involved the exchange of colored tokens, whose shades carried meaning. Their names, in the old formal pronunciation, spoken with a tonal inflection that corresponded to a chromatic key. A concept I could only partially grasp, but whose absence, in Thessaly's case, had been interpreted by Vorn doctrine as a fundamental spiritual incompleteness. She had not been cast out. Nothing so clean as exile. She was still technically present. She was housed, fed through the general delegation supply. Her name was in the formal records. But the Vorn did not speak her name in ceremony. Her mother, Regent Vorn Sitha, had not used her name in a formal context since Thessaly was 9 years old. When the voiding doctrine had been applied to her case by the court, theologians and the world had quietly, bureaucratically, arranged itself around the fact of her non-existence. She told me this over the course of about 3 weeks. In the maintenance corridor, in the dark beside the cracked viewport, while eating the food I brought. She told it without bitterness. That was the thing that stayed with me. She told it the way you describe geography. Here is the mountain. Here is the river. Here is the place where the road ends. She had had years to arrive at this accounting. The grief was in the past tense, packed away somewhere, that she only opened by habit now briefly, when a new piece of it needed to be filed. I listened. I did not offer her sympathy she hadn't asked for, and I did not perform outrage on her behalf. I had the sense she had spent enough of her life watching people perform their discomfort with her situation without actually doing anything. I listened and I asked the occasional question, and I kept bringing the tray. She drew constantly. Every evening she had the compressed paper and the stylus. Her drawings were extraordinary, dense, precise, full of tonal variation, every shade of gray working as hard as it could. She drew the stars through the cracked viewport in exact cartographic detail. She drew the structural ribbing of the freight bay ceiling. She drew my hands one evening while I was eating, and only showed me when she was done. And I looked at the drawing for a long time, because it was so careful and so accurate that it was briefly strange to look at my own hands in life. You see more than most people, I told her. She looked at the drawing. I see differently than most people, she said. That's not a lesser thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, it is by our law. Your law is wrong, I said. She looked at me with that careful dark-eyed assessment. You say that very simply. It's a simple fact, I said. Your law has decided that a difference in perception is a spiritual deficiency. That is empirically wrong. It's also cruel, which is a different kind of wrong. Both are true at once. She was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I thought I had perhaps said too much, or said it too flatly. But when she finally spoke, it was not to push back. It was to say, quietly and with a precision that suggested she was choosing the words from a large and carefully curated internal list. No one has said that to me before, in those exact terms. I imagine most people either agree with the law or are afraid of those who enforce it, said. Yes, she said. That is what they are. There was something in her eyes then that I did not have a clean name for. It was not gratitude. Exactly. It was something older than gratitude, the way a bone is older than the skin above it. It was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has spent a long time being looked through, and who has just been looked at instead. I did not name it. I looked back at the stars. Consul Vrethis found me on a Tuesday morning station calendar, though the days blurred at CADA in the liaison office. He closed the door, which he had not done in any of our previous meetings. He stood in front of my desk with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression arranged in the particular configuration that I had come to, and as his formal register, controlled, considered, fully intentional. Lisan Soane, he said. Shh. I am told you have been making personal contact with a member of my delegation. I make personal contact with everyone who comes through this station, I said. It's the job. I mean specifically, he said. A member of my delegation who is not enrolled in the official provision rotation. I looked at him steadily. Then she's being underserved and I'm correcting it. Something moved in his expression. Not anger, exactly. Something more careful. That individual does not require correction, he said. She is provided for within the delegation's private arrangements. She's sitting alone in a maintenance corridor eating nothing every evening, I said. I've been logging her intake, and it doesn't meet baseline. If it were anyone else on this station, I'd have flagged it as a welfare concern before the first week was out. She is not anyone else, said. That's my point, Consul. His jaw tightened fractionally. I will ask you, Liaison Soan, to understand that the internal arrangements of our delegation are governed by Vorn Protocol, and that Vorn Protocol in this matter is not subject to Kata Station review. Vorn Protocol isn't what I'm reviewing, I said. Caloric intake and basic welfare are what I'm reviewing. Those fall under my station authority. He was silent for a moment. The silence was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man deciding which version of what he had to say to use. I am asking you, he said at last, as a courtesy, to redirect your attention. I appreciate the courtesy, I said. I'll take it under advisement. He studied me for a long moment. Then he unclasped his hands and left. I sat at my desk for a while after he was gone, looking at the transit logs without reading them. I kept bringing the trays. Thessaly noticed the shift in the delegation's demeanor around her. In the week after my conversation with Vrethis, I do not know exactly what he communicated, but the quality of the invisibility around her changed. It became more deliberate, more pointed. The way a wall is different from an absence. People did not accidentally look at her. They chose not to. She told me this without accusation. I think your conversation with the consul has had an effect, she said one evening, with the quiet precision that she brought to everything. I imagine it has, I said. I'm sorry. She shook her head. Do not be. It has been clarifying. She looked down at the sketch she was making. The station's underbelly infrastructure rendered from memory, every cable conduit and strut in its correct place. When people choose not to look at you, it is easier to see them clearly. What do you see? She considered. Fear, she said. The consul is afraid, not of you, of what you represent. Person outside the doctrine who does not observe its rules. If you see me, it becomes harder for them to maintain that I am not there. She looked up at me. The doctrine requires consensus. You have refused to give it. This is not a small thing. Didn't know I was making a theological statement, I said. I thought I was bringing dinner. You were doing both, she said. And the small, contained smile was there again, briefly, before she looked back at her drawing. There was a boy in the delegation. Thessaly's half-nephew, Orev, the son of her older sister. He was perhaps 8 years old in Vorn counting, a serious, sharp-eyed child who moved through the delegatio with the watchful economy of a child who has learned early to pay attention to adult silences. He had, somewhere in the third week, started appearing at the turn of the maintenance corridor, around the time I usually arrived with the tray. He never came fully into the corridor. He stood at the turn, looking, and then he would retreat. But each evening he came a little further, and by the fourth week, he was sitting on the deck plating 5 meters from us, silently doing whatever it was. Vorn children did with their time, in Orev's case, appeared to involve sorting small component pieces from what looked like a disassembled navigation aid. Neither Thessaly nor I commented on this. We simply accommodated him into the radius of the evening. One night, it was late, past the time I usually stayed. Orev moved closer. He sat 3 meters away. Then he set down his components and looked at me with his serious dark eyes and said, in very careful accord standard, "Why do you come here?" "Work here," I said. "The station is my job." He looked at Thessaly. "But you come here specifically." "Yes, why?" Thessaly did not look up from her drawing, but her hand had stilled on the stylus. I thought about the answer for a moment. Because she was sitting here alone, I said. And there's no good reason for that. Orev processed this. She is voided, he said. Particular flatness of a child, repeating something it has been taught. That's what your doctrine says, I agreed. She cannot see the colors. She sees other things, I said. Look at that drawing she's doing. You can't do that without seeing a great deal. Orev leaned over and looked at the drawing. Thessaly angled it slightly so he could see it better. It was the star field through the cracked viewport, done in her dense, precise grayscale. Hundreds of points of light rendered in every possible shade of darkness and brightness. The damaged atmosphere of the world below shone as a textured gradient. Orev looked at it for a long time. It's the stars, he said. Yes, Thessaly said. You drew all of them, most of them. He sat back and looked at her with an expression I could not fully read. Then he said, My mother says we are not supposed to talk to you. I know, Thessaly said, but I am talking to you. You are, she agreed. He seemed to feel this resolved the matter. He picked up his components and went back to sorting them. He stayed until I left, an hour later. He came back the following evening. He always came back after that. It was Orev who told me, 3 days before the delegation's scheduled departure, that the formal farewell ceremony was going to happen at the hub's main assembly gallery, a long, high-cylingered space that the station used for official proceedings. The full delegation would be addressed by Consul Vrethis. Each member would be formally recognized and their transit documents sealed. The Accord representatives, which included me, as the ranking civil liaison, would witness and countersign. Will Thessaly be in the ceremony? I asked him. Orev looked at me with those serious eyes. She will be present, he said carefully. I understood the distinction. I had been in the station long enough to understand it very well. The night before the ceremony, I went to the maintenance corridor with the tray. Thessaly was there. The sketch pad was there, but she was not drawing. She was looking out through the cracked viewport with her knees drawn up and hands loose in her lap. And there was a quality to her stillness that was different from the practiced invisibility I had first seen. This was not the stillness of someone disappearing. This was the stillness of someone sitting very quietly with something difficult. I set the tray down and sat beside her, closer than I usually did, not by design, because the configuration of the corridor and the angle of the viewport seemed to invite it, and because after weeks of sitting in this corridor, I had stopped being careful about the exact geometry of it. She did not move away. We looked at the stars for a while. Tomorrow, she said eventually. Tomorrow, I said. They will seal the transit documents, she said. Be processed through to the transfer point, and then the negotiation outcome will determine where we go. A pause. I do not know where that will be. Neither do I said. The diplomatic track is. I made a small gesture that she had come to understand as my characterization of the diplomatic track. The corner of her mouth moved. Slow, she said. Uncertain. Both, she was quiet again then. I have been trying to think of what to say. 2. Mark the occasion. I do not have the right words. You don't need to say anything, I said. I want to, she said. I want there to be a word for what this corridor has been, what these evenings have been. She looked down at her hands. In Vorn, we have a term, Keseth, which means approximately the presence of being witnessed, the recognition of existing. It is used in the ceremony of naming when a child is first formally seen by the court. She paused. It is not a word that has been used in relation to me since I was very young. I sat with that for a moment. I don't have an equivalent word, I said. In my language, the closest is probably just being seen. We don't have a formal term for it because we're supposed to see each other as a default. You do not always, she said without accusation. No, I said, we don't. She looked at me. The luminous ring around her dark irises caught the thin light from the viewport. Starlight and the reflected light of the scorched world below, together. You did, she said. You do. I did not have an answer for that. I did not reach for one. We stayed until very late. When I finally left, she had eaten everything on the tray, and the sketchbook was open to a page I had not seen her draw. She had been working on it while I was looking at the stars. It was a drawing of the viewport, the cracked transparency, the stars beyond it, curve of the world below. And in the reflection of the viewport, faint and gray and precise, 2 people sitting side by side on the deck plating, looking outward. She gave it to me as I stood to go. She held it out without preamble, without explanation, and I took it without asking for one. I folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of my duty jacket. Then I walked back up the maintenance corridor, and through the junction door, and back to my quarters, and I sat on the edge of my bunk for a long time without turning on the light. The assembly gallery was a long room. High ceilings, gray composite walls, the functional austerity of a space that had been designed for transit logistics and co-opted for ceremony without any architectural mediation. The lighting was the flat overhead kind that makes everyone look like they are standing in an official document. Full delegation was arranged in hierarchical order. I had expected nothing less. Vrethis at the front, the senior members behind him in their ordained sequence, then the middle rank, then the attendants and staff, and then, at the very edge of the arrangement, not positioned with any particular intention, just present at the far margin of the assembled group, near the wall, Thessaly. She was wearing the simple gray inner robe, not the embroidered outer garments of the others. Sketchbook was under her arm. She had, I noticed, done a small careful drawing on the inside cover. I could not see what it was from my position, but her hand was resting over it. I was standing with the two other Accord liaison staff at the side of the gallery. My role in the ceremony was administrative. I would countersign the transit documents as they were distributed, add my station seal, and witness the formalities. It was not a role that required me to speak, Vrethis began. He was, I will give him this, formally impressive. He had the cadence of someone who had spent decades in ceremonial contexts. The unhurried authority of a man who trusted that rooms would be quiet when he spoke. He addressed each member of the delegation in turn, using the formal Vorn naming convention. Involved both the personal name and a short honorific acknowledging their status within the succession. It took time. 87 people is a long list. I stood and countersigned documents as they were brought to me, and watched. When Vrethis reached the members of Thessaly's approximate tier, I found myself paying very close attention. He named them one by one. The names were formal, carrying their honorific weights, each one acknowledged, with a small bow from the named person, and a corresponding nod from this. He reached the person standing 2 positions from Thessaly. He named them. They bowed. He nodded. He reached the person immediately adjacent to Thessaly. He named them. They bowed. He nodded. And then, he looked past her. His gaze tracked from the person on her left to the next individual in the formal grouping on her right. Without pause, without hesitation, without a single flicker of acknowledgement. As though she were a piece of furniture. As though the space she occupied were simply air. Thessaly did not move. She stood with her sketchbook under her arm, and her eyes forward, and her face arranged in the expression I had first seen in the maintenance corridor. That perfected neutrality, that practiced erasure of reaction. She had known this was coming. She had known it every day of her life since she was 9 years old. She stood in it the way you stand in weather. I had the transit document for the delegation's administrative cluster in my hands. I had been about to add my seal. I put the document down. I walked across the gallery. I did not run. I did not make a scene of the approach. I walked at the pace I walk when I am crossing a corridor. Steady, unhurried, a civil servant moving with purpose. The room noticed, because the room had been very still, and I was the only person moving. I heard the attention shift, the small collective adjustment of breath and posture. I walked until I was standing in front of Thessaly, between her and Vrethis, not blocking him, not making it adversarial, just present. Facing her, she looked at me. Her eyes were very wide. The luminous ring around the dark irises was visible in the flat gallery light, and her expression had, for once, abandoned its neutrality entirely. She looked startled, uncertain. And beneath that, with the eyes of someone who had spent weeks learning to read what her face did when she thought no, one was watching, I could see that she was frightened. Not of me, but of what this was, and what it meant. I held out my hand. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. Thessaly Vorn, I said. The room went still. Not the quiet of a room that has paused, the absolute stillness of a room that has stopped. Vrethis had turned. The delegation had turned. The 2 Accord liaison staff at the side of the gallery had turned. Even the environmental system seemed to hold its breath. I kept my eyes on hers. Thessaly Vorn, I said again. The same way I said everything. Plainly, without performance. Your transit documents require your countersignature. It was bureaucratic language. Deliberately, specifically, exactly bureaucratic language. Because I was a civil liaison officer, and this was my station, and within the walls of This gallery, my station authority, was as valid as Vrethus's ceremonial protocol, and I was going to use it. And I was going to use it by saying her name in a room full of people who had chosen not to. Her eyes stayed on mine for a long moment. Could see the process happening behind them. The recalibration, the enormous quiet work of receiving something she had not allowed herself to expect. Then she took my hand. It was a formal contact, the taking of an offered hand in a professional context, exactly that and nothing more. Fingers were cool and steady. She held my hand the way someone holds the railing on a ship when the water is rough. Not desperately, with intention. "Yes," she said. Her voice was low and clear, and the accent that usually smoothed her accord standard into something careful and precise was, for that single syllable, gone entirely. It was just the word yes. I walked her to the document table. I set her transit papers in front of her and indicated the counter-signature line. She signed. A precise, careful signature in her thin Vorn script, the same hand that drew the stars through the cracked viewport. I added my station seal beside it. Behind us, the room was still processing. Said something in Vorn. I did not understand most of it, but I understood the tone. Sharp, controlled, the voice of a man containing a significant quantity of fury inside a formal register. One of my Accord colleagues moved to intercept him, which was the correct instinct, and I heard the murmur of professional damage control beginning. I did not turn around. I was looking at Thessaly. She had taken her hand back. Now that the document was signed, she held it in front of her, both her hands together, and she was looking at her own, fingers with an expression that I could not name and did not try to. Then she looked up at me. Across the gallery, in the margin of the assembled delegation, Orev was standing. He had broken from his position, quietly, without anyone apparently noticing, because everyone's attention was directed elsewhere. He had moved to where he could see directly. He was watching Thessaly with his serious, dark eyes. When Thessaly's gaze found him, something shifted in his face. Not the professing of an adult trying to understand the political implications of what had just happened. Something younger and simpler and more urgent than that. He said something in Vorn, too quickly for me to track, even with the field-grade chip. Thessaly heard it. And when she heard it, she closed her eyes for a moment, briefly. The way someone closes their eyes when they are receiving something that requires a moment of private containment. When she opened them, she looked at me, and she said, "He says that is her. He says she is real." I thought of the long corridor, cracked viewport. The drawing folded in the inside pocket of my duty jacket, of two people sitting side by side looking at the stars. "He's right," I said. The formal ceremony eventually resumed. Vrethus completed the naming list. He did not revisit Thessaly's name. He did not object to the signed document, because to have objected would have required him to formally dispute the station authorities. Countersignature, which would have created a legal complication the Vorn diplomatic track did not need. He was, as I had always thought, a pragmatic man inside his ideology. He filed the document with the rest, and the ceremony concluded. Afterward, in the dispersal of the gallery, as people collected their papers, and the delegation reorganized itself for the transport queue, Thessaly found me near the door. She had the sketchbook under her arm. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "The word I told you, Kesath." "Being witnessed," I said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I would like, if it is possible, to send you drawings. The diplomatic relay. Where the transit takes me." She looked at the sketchbook. "If the negotiation resolves, or while it does not." "I'd like that," I said. She nodded. Then she held out her free hand, the same gesture, the same intention, formal and steady. I took it. We held the handshake for a moment longer than the professional context required, and I felt the coolness of her fingers and the deliberate evenness of her grip. "Aldrich Sohn," she said. The first time she had used my full name, she said it with the careful precision she brought to everything, and with something underneath it that I recognized from the weeks in the corridor. That oldest form of recognition, the one that lives in the bone. "Thessaly Vorn," I said. She let go and walked back to her delegation. I watched her cross the gallery, upright, unhurried, carrying her sketchbook. She did not look like a person who had practiced invisibility. She looked like a person who had decided sometime recently to stop. I went back to my desk. The water recycler on deck 10 was flagging errors again. The transit queue for the afternoon had 17 processing holds. The diplomatic track was, as always, slow and uncertain. I sat at my desk, and I took the folded drawing out of the inside pocket of my duty jacket. I unfolded it carefully. 2 people. A cracked viewport. The stars, every one of them, rendered in every possible shade of gray. I found a clear space on the wall of my office, and I put it up. It is still there.